Maiden Day. So we're going to take you through the sort of pre-flight checks that you should do on the first day of your Maiden. Now let's talk about a couple of things that should already have happened to this point. So with the blades removed, you should have already programmed your ESC. You should have made sure that your motor direction is correct, which is main rotor turning clockwise and tail rotor turning counterclockwise. So make sure your tail belt is twisted correctly such that clockwise main rotor equals counterclockwise tail rotor. Make sure your blades are going in the right direction. The leading edges, which is the sort of thicker part, and the trailing edge, which is thinner, are rotating first in those directions. And then most importantly, make sure your throttle cut mechanism is set up such that when you turn your transmitter on and set your switches correctly, there's no way that the main rotor can spool up. In the case of the V-Control Touch, I actually have two switches. I have a motor safety switch and then a throttle cut switch. So both of them have to be in the correct position before the helicopter can spool up. So it's just a little bit of extra safety there. You also should have set your center of gravity such that the helicopter balances like we talked about in the last video on the main mast there. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and slide the battery tray in. Make sure you get that positive click and then just give the battery a little tug. Make sure that everything is okay. I'm gonna check my throttle cut switches. Those are correct. And then we're gonna go ahead and plug it in. Next thing you need to check is that for your first spool up, some speed control manufacturers require that you do a certain thing to help calibrate the ESC. Now I've already set the throttle endpoints, which you should do as well. So you let the ESC know where full throttle and zero throttle are. But I'm gonna go ahead and check that my bank 1, which is where I'm gonna go ahead and spool the helicopter up, is set to 50%. In the case of the Hoppywing ESC, you're gonna spool it up at 0 pitch on the pad and not touch it for 30 seconds, and then kill power, pull the plug, and ensure that you've calibrated 50, and then you can set it to where you want it to be. In my case, for my throttle curve initially, I'm gonna start with 70, 75, and 80. Next thing we need to check are control throw directions and gyro corrections. Now, what's the difference between those two things? Control throw directions are when the transmitter tells the helicopter to go a certain way, the rotor should turn a certain direction, right? That's me telling the helicopter what to do. Gyro corrections are the gyro built into your flybarless unit, right? It needs to know how to correct the helicopter. If, let's say, a wind gust twists it off course, it's going to correct back, right? The gyro is trying to keep the helicopter doing what it was last asked to do, which if that's fly forward and straight and level flight and a wind gust tries to balloon it off one direction, it's going to counter against that a little bit. So we want to make sure those gyro corrections are correct, because what we don't want, if they aren't correct, you could literally be spooling it up on the landing pad, right, and about to lift off, and when the helicopter starts to drift to the left, instead of correcting to the right, the gyro will correct the wrong direction and actually add more, and your helicopter will just tip over and flip into the ground. So extremely important to make sure you get both your main rotor and tail rotor corrections correct. All right, first let's do control throw directions. I'm gonna point the helicopter right at you, and we're gonna be focusing on the swash plate here. So I'm going to go left cyclic. So that's left aileron, essentially, if you're thinking this in airplane terms. And the left side of the swash plate should dip down, and it does. We're gonna go right cyclic. The right side of the swash plate here dips down, and it does. We're gonna go forward cyclic. The front of the helicopter should dip down, and it does. That makes the helicopter nose down. Rear cyclic, there we go. I've got the rear of the swash plate dipping down, forward, backward, left, right. So that's correct in terms of control. Now what I'm gonna do is pick the helicopter up and I'm gonna lean it in a variety of directions. And if you've told the flybarless unit its orientation, meaning is it upright, is it sideways, are the plugs at the front or plugs at the back, it should correct directly. And what the gyro correction is gonna try and do is keep this swash plate as level as possible. So if I tilt it to the left, it should rock the swash plate to the right. So let's pick it up and see what happens. I'm gonna grab this way so you can see a little better. So I go left, and you see how as I rotate it this way sideways, it's trying to keep the swash plate level. I'm gonna do the same thing sideways. I'm just gonna get behind the tail rotor here. So as I tilt the helicopter forwards, the swash goes backwards. Same thing, as I rock the helicopter back and forth, the swash plate is trying to stay level. There we go, so those corrections are correct. Let's take a look at the tail. So I'm gonna flip this up so that you can see the tail. Now, in the case of the tail, we're looking at the trailing edge of the top tail blade, right? So as I move my stick to the left, the trailing edge should go to the left, this direction. And it does. If I move it to the right, it should go to the right. So right to right, left to left. And if you face your transmitter the same orientation as the front of the helicopter, they'll line up. So left is left, right is right, left is left, right is right. Now we need to check and see if our gyro corrections are correct. Again, we're going to look at the trailing edge. As I move the tail boom this direction, the trailing edge should go this direction towards the boom because it's countering that movement. As I move it towards me, the trailing edge should go towards me. So away from me, towards me, towards me. The gyro corrections are correct. So, again, when I move the helicopter away from me, the trailing edge should go away from me, and it does. When I move it towards me, it should come towards me. Okay, so that's our gyro corrections checked, our control directions checked, we've got our ESC set up down, our throttle cut checked, and we've got our initial spool up checked. There's nothing left to do but put this thing on the pad and see what's going on. One other quick tip. You need to establish a way to know when to land. Now that can be as simple as just a timer built into your radio system, or as complicated as a telemetry-based system based on the capacity of the battery pack. In the case of the V-Control Touch, that's what I'm doing. I have the special telemetry cable from my ESC to my FBL, and it's actually going to tell me when I'm running out of battery capacity if I tell the radio when I boot it up what size battery is in the helicopter. Make sure that your timer, at the very least, is in place and start it conservatively, right? Depending on your head speed, set it for 3.5 to 4 minutes land, and then measure the capacity using a battery tester at that point, and then slowly increase by 20 or 30 seconds at a time until with your flight style and typical head speeds, you know when it's time to land. It's much better to land conservatively and realize you had more in the tank at first as you get used to a new helicopter than to go the other way and deplete the battery pack too much. All right. Enough of me yammering. Let's get this thing on the pad and spool it up. Now for the first spool up, I'm going to do it with no canopy on. We do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, if anything unfortunate happens, I don't have to replace an $80 canopy. That's the largest reason. Number two, we can just see the inner workings of the helicopter as we spool it up for the first time. So we can see and hear a little better if anything is untoward. It also makes it easy after I've done this 50% spool up for the hobby wing to unplug the battery, replug it and reset it, and then I'll go ahead and put the canopy on. All right, enough going on. Let's get this thing on the pad. All right, now we can boot up at our intended throttle. We've got our plan here for our spool up, which is that we're just going to pull this up into a hover and see what happens.
Motor on.
Here we go. First thing we're going to do is just check that everything does as we expect it to, and all the controls are correct. And then we're just going to settle it into a hover and take a look. Seems to be, that's hands off right there. Not drifting, tiny bit of a tail wag, but again, we haven't done any tuning yet, so that's to be expected. And then in a second I'm going to land and put a canopy on now that I know that nothing terrible is going to happen. And I just want to kind of check it out, because I need the canopy for help with orientation. I struggle with that one.
90%.
So just doing some gentle forward circuits. I'm going to try and find a flat spot in the grass and set it down. I should, however, take this moment, look at the head speed. All right, we're at 1750 in idle up one, which is perfect. It's right where I want to be. Now I don't use a normal mode, so that's my bank one. And we're just going to find a nice spot in the grass.
Motor idle.
And set it
Motor
down.
off.
And you can hear how high the grass is. That's the tail blades eating away at it. All right, I'm going to bring it back to the bench and put a canopy on. All right, you can see already from here that it's a heck of a lot easier to see with that canopy on. All right, I'm going to go ahead and spool it up.
Motor on.
And then move into the rest of our Maiden. Now, these are all stock values in the Neo right now. I haven't done anything
30%.
other than tell it it's a 600 size helicopter. So again, we're just going to do some forward circuits kind of moving towards some faster forward flight. I'm looking at the tail boom here, trying to look at head gain to see am I getting any sort of oscillations, and the answer is at this head speed, none. And then we're going to look at the tail slowly a little bit, mainly for the main level of gain, but I don't worry about tail wags too much unless they're horrible on the first flights, because the helicopter really needs to kind of bed in. It needs to loosen up.
Battery 70%.
We'll sort of gently start to challenge the tail. Just some sort of gentle funnels here. Sounds a little angry, but not too bad. And usually in the V-bar, the defaults are a hair on the high side. We typically end up chipping away at them a little, so not surprised.
Battery 60%.
Sort of looking at agility a little bit here, kind of making sure I have equal amounts of kind of up and down pitch available. Yeah, this is a pretty low head speed right now for this helicopter. This is 1750 RPM.
Battery 50%.
And considering a lot of guys will fly this at 2300 to 2400. Again, watching the tail boom in backwards flight here. Seeing how it does. A bit more funnels. Well, you know, every now and then you get lucky and a helicopter just flies great out of the box.
Battery 30%.
I gotta say, initial impressions are pretty darn good. Now, right now I only have a 4500 milliamp pack in here. I have 3 packs to try today. I've got a 4500, a 5000, and a 5500. Wow, even in a sideways loop, the tail's not angry. It's a great maneuver if you can do one, but again, you only need to tune to your ability. If you're a beginner and just hovering, all you're really looking at is, are the directions all good? And do you have any large shakes? Is the boom, you know, shaking in gentle forward flight? Is the tail wagging quickly or slowly? And making note of those observations. We're not going to do a ton of tuning on the first flight. We're just observing the helicopter. How's it doing? Keeping an eye on our timer. We're worried about battery capacity until we understand how this works.
Battery 20%. Battery 10%. Rotor idle. Rotor off.
Boom. This thing flies fantastic. All right. Successful Maiden, done and in the books. We're now here a few weeks later in the new content studio I'm putting together. And as I'm sure you can tell that I've changed the Nimbus a little bit. So I did pick up at Urcho one of the new Nimbus canopies from Heli Direct. I put a little vinyl on the fin. You know, I like my helis to maybe look a little bit different than everybody else's. But mostly for visibility, right? That blue and yellow canopy was great, but this one is definitely better against the green tree line of my local field. So that's helped. I've got a ton more flights on the Nimbus. I'm happy to report, or thrilled to report, honestly, that it's been flying fantastic. I really haven't had to do a ton to it tuning-wise or maintenance-wise. It's held together really well. But let's talk a little bit about, you've just finished your first maiden flight and the things you want to check and think about. So we'll divide those up into kind of a few categories here. So the first is battery and telemetry. Did whatever telemetry setup you have for battery capacity work for you, or did your timer work for you? Again, set that timer conservatively, come back with a battery checker and check your battery voltage. You don't really want to take it much below 3.8 volts per cell, 3.75 per cell. If you want to play it fairly conservatively like I do, I try and land at storage charge. So make sure that that's working. If not, adjust your timer or telemetry to suit. We also want to give the helicopter a really thorough once-over after the first flight, right? We're going to check, every nut, bolt, and screw, make sure everything's okay, make sure nothing's, vibrated out and has started to loosen up. Check all your ball links, your tail linkages, tail push rod. You really want to give, take the canopy off, give the helicopter a really thorough once-over. Check the temperature on the motor and ESC. Are they screaming hot, or are they about where you expected them to be? Look for excessive belt dust, right? There may be some on any maiden when you first spool up a helicopter, but make sure there's not a ton, which is a sign that something's rubbing or, maybe behaving in a way that it shouldn't be. So, keep your eyes out for sort of all of those details. And then get a few more flights in on the maiden day, right? You can, start to do some initial tuning. I usually like 2 or 3 flights before I go too crazy on tuning the tail. Just because all these parts have to kind of wear in, right? They're all rotating, they're all brand new, and they need to sort of get a little bit of wear on them before you go too crazy with the tuning. Otherwise, you can literally chase your tail, pun not intended, trying to catch up with things. But at this point, I had to do very little tuning to mine. I did a little bit of adjustments in tail gain to reduce it a tiny bit, but it's been flying fantastic. No wags or shakes or bobbles. I reduced the head gain just a tiny bit, and it's been a fantastic flying heli. Honestly, this helicopter gives me a lot of confidence to try new moves, especially because I know that the parts don't cost a ton to replace, and it's the perfect, mid-size helicopter where a crash isn't crazy expensive if you do put it in, and parts are readily available everywhere. So honestly, a fantastic choice, a great first choice for a first kit build for a beginner, especially in conjunction with this build video to sort of help you if you, run into any steps in the manual that may give you a little bit of difficulty. Okay, let's talk budget. I promised I would. I build this as the budget build, so let's talk a little bit about that, right? So is this the lowest budget, or the cheapest way you can get into this helicopter? No, absolutely not. I chose components that I can stand behind and that Heli Direct stands behind because we trust their quality. We know the manufacturers and their products are fantastic. Are there cheaper servos you can find on Amazon or some other websites? Sure, absolutely. Are there cheaper, less expensive motors? Absolutely. Can you pick up components on the used market? Yes, with some caveats, right? There are some drawbacks to buying used, and maybe we'll talk about that in another video sometime. But yes, there are ways to spend less. But if you're buying all new components and you want solid, reputable components from excellent brands, then this is what I would consider a budget build. It's not top-of-the-line servos. I didn't go for the all-out, most powerful motor. The ESC is a reasonable choice, versus a fancier, let's say, YGE or Contronic ESC with more features and better telemetry, potentially. So these are all sort of middle-of-the-road choices. So that's why I called it the budget build. So let's start with our cyclic servos. I went with Theta THM 988 cyclic servos. Those are only $80 each. But you need 3 of them, so there's $240 right there. For the tail, now this one I splurged a little bit because I like this tail servo and I have no complaints. I've used it in a bunch of my helicopters, and that's the Theta Razor T1 cyclic servo. That is their top-of-the-line tail servo. It is fully programmable. There are cheaper choices from a lot of great manufacturers, such as Torque, for example, is another great choice there of tail servo. And that servo is $130, so I splurged a little bit there. As far as ESCs go, here I went, really budget here. but not light on features or functionality, right? Hobbywing is an excellent ESC that'll serve you well for years. I have them in about half of my helicopters, with the other half being YGE, but that's a premium ESC that comes with a premium price. The Hobbywing 120 amp ESC is $125, so very reasonable as far as ESCs go. Will stay with you for a long time. Has great telemetry with the V-Bar Neo. It'll count down your battery capacity if you add that extra telemetry wire we talked about. So a great choice there. In terms of flybarless units, I didn't go budget here. I went with the V-Bar Neo. It's what I fly currently in all my helicopters, and so I wanted to stay in that same sort of ecosystem of radio and FBL. That's a $250 flybarless unit. There are cheaper units, such as the Icon, which I would recommend, and others, right? That's personal preference as well as what you can get help with. If you're a beginner and you're starting out locally, I would highly recommend a flybarless unit that someone in your area can help you with, right? So if there are other pilots in a club, what's everyone else flying? And I would think about going that direction, so it's very easy for me to get help. Although these days, it's very easy to get help online as well. So make your choice wisely there. Now, in terms of motors, I didn't really go budget here, but I think this is a very reasonably priced motor for a helicopter this size. And if you pick it up on sale, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you can get an even better deal. So I went with the EgoDrift Beta 4025 HT 1050 kV. The price on that motor is $260 new. So, great motor, tons of power. This motor can grow with this helicopter, right? So, what we talked about with the gearing and the pinion choice, I mean, I've got my head speeds fairly low. For beginners, that's great. As you saw in the video, it still gives you plenty of power for tumbles and rolls and flips and loops and all those things. But it could also, one quick change of the pinion back to the stock pinion, you've got gobs more power and a lot more head speed. So if that's the direction you want to go, when we're working your way towards hard 3D, this motor will stay with you the whole time. You won't have to buy a new motor. While there are cheaper motors you can go with here with less power, which would be great for beginners, you may find yourself upgrading the motor down the road as you get into advanced 3D. So you make some trade-offs there. I'm obviously a huge fan of EgoDrift. In full disclosure, I'm also a sponsored pilot with them, but I've owned tons of them before I ever joined the team. I'm just a big fan of the product, the reliability, customer service, etc. It's, you know, I've got no complaints. I haven't touched any of my motors since I installed them, and I like it that way. They also run nice and cool and are very efficient, so you get some nice long flight times, which is nice. All right, let's talk batteries. Now, there's a lot of choices in the battery market, a lot of great brands out there. You can go on the low end of the scale and roll the dice with, you know, lipos off of Amazon, or you can go with a name brand that you know and trust, which is what I did. In my case, I went with a 6S battery from Pulse. I will say I tested both the 6S 4500 milliamp, 5000 milliamp, and 5500 milliamp in this helicopter. The 5500 flew a little too heavy for my taste, but the 5000 and 4500 are excellent choices for this helicopter. With a higher head speed, the 5000 is probably, or the 5500 rather, is probably great. But I decided to go with the 4500 and 5000. On the 4500, the helicopter flies crazy light. I got 6.5 minutes at that lower 1750 RPM and tons of flight time. You know, by 6.5 minutes, you're ready to land and kind of rest your nerves a little bit and then think about what you want to work on the next flight. So, 4500 to 5000s, Pulse is a brand I know and trust. I get tons of cycles on my packs. They don't puff, and they've held up really well for me, so I certainly recommend those. Now, blade choice. Here's another area where you really can't go wrong as long as you stick with name brand manufacturers. I wanted to try out the spin blades here on my Nimbus. Honestly, because A, I like trying lots of new blades. I still haven't quite decided what the perfect blade is for me. And honestly, really the way to find this out is to just try lots of different brands of blades in different lengths and sizes for the helicopter. So these are 555 millimeter blades from Spin. These are $90 for the main blades and $24 for the Spin tail blades. Those are 95 millimeters. And I've been super happy with them. They're plenty agile. They seem to do fine at low head speed. But there are lots of other great brands out there. Rotor Tech was another one. You know, Switch is another one. All of which are available at HeliDirect and other retailers. So tons of choices out there. You really can't go wrong trying them all out. Azure is another great choice as well. So okay, so the Nimbus kit is $570, and that gets you all of the kit but none of the electronics. That's a very reasonable price for a kit in that size range. You won't find much of a better price from any other manufacturer in the market. They're all in about that same level. So what does that add up to? So if you take one battery, all the electronics needed, and the kit, it adds up to a whopping $1,829. Now I know as a number that sounds crazy, and you're like, how do we get from $500 for the kit to $1,800 for the whole kit and caboodle? Honestly, it is an expensive hobby. You will find as you sort of get into it and purchase electronics that if you purchase wisely and get good quality electronics, which certainly all of the items in this helicopter are, you'll find that those electronics will move from helicopter to helicopter as you grow. So as you either crash to the point where a repair doesn't make sense, or you move on from model, or there's just too much wear and tear on it and you want to try something new, the electronics will often be able to take right out of that model and move to the next. So the electronics are an investment that will move from model to model and stay with you for probably many years in the hobby. So I know it sounds like a big number, but keep that in mind. Now the other thing to keep in mind is that HeliDirect and most manufacturers in the hobby have regular sales. Now I know patience is difficult, but all major US holidays have 10% off sales in general. Other than a brand new kit release, which won't go on sale immediately typically, you can get 10% off on everything. Electronics, helicopter kit, the whole deal. So that's a savings of almost $200, taking the price down to $1,647. So $1,647 on sale, you get everything you need. So that helps, a couple $100 is a significant savings, so it certainly pays to wait for those 10% off sales. With that is a wrap on the Nimbus 550 build series. Thanks for coming along. Feel free to drop messages in the comments. You can also hit me up on Facebook at Nick Wisdom RC. You can catch me on the RC Heli Nation version 3 podcast at most podcasters as well, and hit me at nickwisdom@rchnv3.com via email if you've got questions too. I look forward to hopefully running into you at a local fun fly. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions at all. I hope you enjoy your Nimbus 550s. Thanks for watching. I'm Nick Wisdom, and this is Hack TV.
Direct!